In 1787, a child was born who would die in his bed, stabbed by his own brothers, having conquered an empire that stretched across tens of thousands of square miles. A child mocked as illegitimate, an outcast whose very existence was considered shameful, would transform a minor clan of 1,500 people into the most feared military machine southern Africa had ever seen. His name was Shaka, and in just 12 years, he would forge the Zulu nation from nothing, revolutionize African warfare with tactics so brilliant that European military historians would later compare him to Napoleon Bonaparte, and build an empire through sheer tactical genius and unrelenting psychological warfare. But here's what they don't tell you about the warrior king who changed the face of an entire continent. The same brilliance that made him unstoppable, the same ruthlessness that terrified his enemies, would ultimately consume him from within. And by the end of this story, you'll understand why the greatest conquerors in history often carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. Our story begins in the rolling hills of southeastern Africa, in a time when the continent was a patchwork of hundreds of independent chiefdoms, each competing for cattle, land, and survival. This was a world governed by ancient traditions, where a chief's legitimacy depended on lineage, where honor meant everything, and where shame could destroy not just an individual but an entire family line. The Zulu people, in 1787, were nothing special. They were a small clan among many, numbering perhaps 1,500 souls, living in traditional beehive huts made of woven grass, herding cattle across the green hills of what is now KwaZulu-Natal province in South Africa. They had no empire, no grand ambitions, no reason to believe they would become anything more than another footnote in the complex tapestry of African kingdoms. Picture this: a young woman named Nandi, beautiful and strong-willed, catches the eye of Senzingakona, the chief of this modest Zulu clan. What happens between them violates every social convention of their society. Nandi becomes pregnant outside of marriage, a scandal so profound that it threatens to destroy both their reputations. When Senzingakona's elders confront him about Nandi's swelling belly, he dismisses it as nothing more than an intestinal beetle, an ishaka, that was causing the appearance of pregnancy. But when the child is born, undeniably real and undeniably his, Senzingakona is forced by tradition to marry Nandi. The boy is named Shaka, after his father's humiliating excuse, a name that would become a constant reminder of shame, illegitimacy, and rejection. From his earliest years, Shaka understood what it meant to be unwanted. Contemporary accounts from oral historians who preserved these stories describe a childhood marked by relentless bullying. Other children mocked him for his parentage, calling him the son of shame, the beetle child. His father, embarrassed by the circumstances of his birth, showed him little affection. When Shaka was just 6 years old, Senzingakona sent Nandi and her son away, exiling them from the Zulu clan entirely. This wasn't just rejection. This was erasure. Mother and son wandered from clan to clan, seeking refuge, facing contempt and poverty wherever they went. Imagine being a child in this world, watching your mother, once the lover of a chief, reduced to begging for shelter, working as a servant, enduring the whispers and sneers of people who saw you both as walking symbols of disgrace. But here's the fascinating part. This brutal childhood, this experience of being the eternal outsider, forged something extraordinary in young Shaka. Where other children learned to seek approval and fit in, Shaka learned to observe, to analyze, to question every tradition that had been used to humiliate him. He developed a burning resentment toward the weakness he saw in traditional leadership, toward chiefs who ruled by birthright rather than merit, toward a military system that valued ceremony over effectiveness. Every slight, every moment of rejection was being stored away, transformed into fuel for an ambition that would reshape an entire region. When Shaka was a teenager, he and his mother finally found protection under Dingiswayo, the chief of the Mthethwa people, a larger and more powerful kingdom. This was the turning point. Dingiswayo was himself a revolutionary figure, a chief who was experimenting with new forms of military organization and regional alliance building. He recognized something in the tall, brooding young man with the illegitimate past. He enrolled Shaka in his military forces, the Amabutho age regiment system, where young men were organized into fighting units based on their age group rather than their clan affiliation. Here, finally, was a place where Shaka could prove himself not through his father's name, but through his own abilities. And prove himself he did. Shaka threw himself into military training with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He studied every aspect of warfare, from tactics to weaponry to the psychology of combat, but more importantly, he began to question everything. The traditional weapon of African warfare was the assegai, a long-throwing spear used in combat that kept fighters at a distance from one another. Battles were often ritualized affairs, with warriors hurling spears at each other from relatively safe distances, with relatively few casualties. To Shaka, this was absurd. This wasn't warfare, this was theater. What Shaka created wasn't just a new weapon, it was a completely new philosophy of combat. He designed the iklua, a short stabbing spear with a broad blade, named for the sucking sound it made when withdrawn from a body. Contemporary accounts describe Shaka's reasoning with chilling clarity. He told his warriors that throwing a spear meant giving your enemy a weapon. It meant fighting from a distance where fear and hesitation could dominate. The iklua forced close combat. It required warriors to look into the eyes of the men they killed. It required courage, discipline, and absolute commitment. Shaka didn't just give his warriors a new weapon. He gave them a new identity as the only men brave enough to fight with their hands red with enemy blood. But the iklua was just the beginning. Shaka revolutionized military tactics in ways that would influence warfare for generations. He developed what became known as the bullhorn formation, a tactical innovation so effective that military historians still study it today. Picture the battlefield. Your main force, the chest, advances directly toward the enemy, engaging them in frontal combat. Meanwhile, two flanking units, the horns, sprint in wide arcs around both sides of the enemy formation. A reserve force, the loins, sits behind the main force, ready to exploit any weakness. When executed properly, this formation didn't just defeat enemies. It completely surrounded and annihilated them, leaving almost no survivors to retreat and warn other chiefdoms of what was coming. To make this system work required training that was unprecedented in the region. Shaka drilled his warriors relentlessly, forcing them to march up to 50 miles in a single day, barefoot, across terrain that would exhaust modern soldiers wearing boots. He implemented a rule that would become legendary for its brutality. Any warrior who showed cowardice in battle, who retreated without orders, who failed to kill an enemy, would be executed immediately along with his entire family. This wasn't just discipline. This was the systematic elimination of the very concept of failure from the military consciousness. Shaka created warriors who would rather die fighting than face the consequences of defeat. Here's what made Shaka different from other military innovators of his time. He understood that warfare wasn't just about weapons and tactics. It was about psychology, about terror, about breaking the enemy's will before the first spear was even thrown. He developed intimidation rituals that were designed to paralyze opponents with fear. His warriors would approach enemy settlements performing war dances, rhythmically stomping the earth, chanting in perfect unison, beating their shields with their spears in a sound like rolling thunder. They moved with mechanical precision, thousands of men acting as a single organism, their faces painted, their bodies oiled and gleaming. Imagine being a farmer in a small village, watching this approaching from across the valley. You're holding a throwing spear, standing next to your neighbors, and you realize you're about to face something that isn't just an army. It's a force of nature. Between his late teens and his mid-20s, Shaka earned a reputation as the most formidable warrior in the Mthethwa kingdom. He led raids against neighboring clans, always returning victorious, always covered in the glory that had been denied to him as a child. Other warriors whispered about him with a mixture of awe and fear, but Shaka hadn't forgotten his origins. He hadn't forgotten the Zulu clan that had cast him out, the father who had rejected him, the life of shame his mother had been forced to endure. In 1816, when Senzingakona died, Shaka saw his opportunity. With Dingiswayo's support, Shaka returned to the tiny Zulu clan, not as the rejected son, but as a conquering warrior backed by the most powerful kingdom in the region. What happened next would change everything. Shaka didn't just become chief of the Zulu, he transformed them. He immediately began implementing the military system he had perfected, organizing every able-bodied man into age regiments, introducing the iklua and the bullhorn formation, drilling them until they moved with the same terrifying precision as the Mthethwa warriors. But here's the genius part. Shaka understood that military power alone wasn't enough to build an empire. He needed to create loyalty, unity, and a shared identity that transcended the old clan system. When Shaka conquered neighboring chiefdoms, and he conquered them rapidly, he didn't follow the traditional pattern of simply taking their cattle and leaving them weakened. Instead, he absorbed them entirely. Young men from conquered peoples were integrated into the Zulu age regiments, where they fought alongside men from other clans, forging bonds of brotherhood that replaced old clan loyalties. Conquered chiefs who submitted willingly were often allowed to retain some authority under Zulu supervision. Those who resisted were killed, and their followers were dispersed into the Zulu system. Shaka was building something unprecedented, not just a military force but a nation, a new identity that made Zulu mean something far greater than a small clan with a humiliating origin story. This brings us to 1817, and the moment that would catapult Shaka from regional chief to empire builder. Dingiswayo, Shaka's mentor and protector, was killed through treachery by a rival chief named Zwide of the Ndwandwe people. This should have been a disaster for Shaka. The Mthethwa kingdom began to fragment without its leader, and Zwide's forces, numbering in the tens of thousands, turned their attention toward the upstart Zulu chief who was becoming dangerously powerful. But what Zwide couldn't have predicted was that he had just eliminated the last restraint on Shaka's ambitions. Now there was no overlord to answer to, no higher authority to moderate his actions. Shaka was free to implement his vision without compromise. The war between Shaka and Zwide became the defining conflict of Shaka's rise. The Ndwandwe outnumbered the Zulu forces significantly, and in their first major engagement, Shaka employed tactics that demonstrated his absolute mastery of psychological warfare. When Zwide's army approached, Shaka ordered his warriors to retreat to avoid direct engagement, to draw the Ndwandwe deeper into Zulu territory. This wasn't cowardice. This was strategy. Shaka was forcing the Ndwandwe to extend their supply lines, to exhaust themselves marching through unfamiliar terrain, to grow overconfident. Meanwhile, Zulu scouts conducted constant harassment raids, attacking the Ndwandwe at night, disrupting their sleep, killing stragglers, creating an atmosphere of constant anxiety. When Shaka finally chose to engage in a decisive battle, he selected the terrain carefully. The battle took place on the Mhladu's River, where Shaka's forces held the high ground. The Ndwandwe, exhausted from weeks of frustrating pursuit, found themselves trapped between the Zulu army and the river. What happened next was a masterpiece of the bullhorn formation. The Zulu chest engaged the Ndwandwe center, while the horns swept around both flanks. Contemporary accounts describe the battle as less of a fight and more of a slaughter. Thousands of Ndwandwe warriors were killed, many drowning in the river as they tried to escape the encirclement. Zwide himself barely escaped with his life, his army shattered, his power broken. But the real crisis was that Shaka's victory over the Ndwandwe created a problem that would define the next decade of southern African history. The defeated Ndwandwe people, along with other groups fleeing Zulu expansion, were forced to migrate, to search for new lands where they could escape Shaka's reach. This migration, known as the Mfecking or the crushing, would trigger a chain reaction of conflict and displacement that affected millions of people across southern and central Africa. Groups pushed from their traditional lands invaded territories held by others, who in turn were forced to migrate, creating waves of warfare and social disruption that reached as far as modern-day Tanzania and Zimbabwe. Shaka hadn't just built an empire. He had fundamentally reshaped the demographic and political map of half a continent. Between 1816 and 1824, the Zulu nation grew from a minor clan of 1,500 people to a regional superpower with an estimated 50,000 warriors under arms. Let that sink in for a moment. In less than a decade, Shaka had increased his military force by over 3,000%. The Zulu-controlled territory spanning thousands of square miles, encompassing hundreds of previously independent chiefdoms. Every aspect of Zulu society was now organized around military efficiency. Young men lived in military barracks, forbidden to marry until they had proven themselves in combat and been granted permission by Shaka himself. This created a force of warriors with no divided loyalties, no families to worry about, nothing to focus on except war and service to their king. Shaka's administrative genius matched his military brilliance. He established a system of roads that allowed for rapid communication across his empire. Messages could travel from one end of Zulu territory to another in days rather than weeks. He created a network of regional commanders who answered directly to him, bypassing traditional clan hierarchies and ensuring that loyalty flowed to the center rather than to local chiefs. He revolutionized the Zulu economy by controlling the distribution of cattle, the primary form of wealth in the region. Warriors who distinguished themselves received cattle as rewards, creating an incentive structure that tied individual prosperity to military success and loyalty to Shaka. But here's where the story becomes almost mythical in its tragedy. The very qualities that made Shaka an unparalleled conqueror, the ruthlessness, the absolute demand for loyalty, the inability to tolerate weakness or dissent, contained within them the mechanism of his destruction. Shaka had built a system that required him to be perfect, to be the supreme warrior king, the living embodiment of Zulu power. Any sign of weakness, any crack in his armor of invincibility, would threaten the entire structure he had created. In 1827, Nandi died. Shaka's mother, the woman who had endured exile and humiliation with him, the one person who had been constant throughout his rise from rejected child to emperor, was gone. What happened next reveals the depth of Shaka's psychological fragility beneath his warrior exterior. Contemporary European traders who were beginning to establish contact with the Zulu kingdom recorded accounts of Shaka's reaction that border on the unbelievable. He declared a year of mourning during which no crops could be planted, no milk could be drunk, and any woman who became pregnant would be killed because she had dared to be happy during his grief. He ordered the execution of thousands of people whose mourning he deemed insufficient. Warriors were sent out to kill anyone who didn't demonstrate adequate sorrow, turning the Zulu heartland into a landscape of terror and death. This wasn't grief. This was a mental breakdown playing out on a national scale. Shaka had spent his entire life transforming pain into power, channeling rejection into ambition, converting weakness into strength through sheer force of will. But Nandi's death opened a wound that couldn't be conquered through military tactics or intimidation. For the first time, Shaka was facing an enemy he couldn't defeat, his own trauma, his own humanity, the little boy who had been called the beetle child and had never truly healed from that shame. As the months following Nandi's death turned into a year, Shaka's behavior became increasingly erratic and paranoid. He saw conspiracy everywhere. He began executing his most trusted advisors on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. Warriors who had fought beside him for years were killed based on rumors or the interpretations of witch doctors who claimed to divine treason through their rituals. The Zulu people, who had revered Shaka as their deliverer, began to fear him as a tyrant. The system he had built, which depended on absolute loyalty born from respect and fear in equal measure, was tipping dangerously toward fear alone. And when people are afraid enough, when they have nothing left to lose, they become capable of desperate actions. Shaka had two half-brothers, Dingaan and Emachlengana, sons of Senzingakona by different mothers. They watched Shaka's descent into paranoid tyranny with growing alarm and, it must be said, with growing ambition. They were of royal blood, potential heirs to the Zulu throne, but as long as Shaka lived, they were merely subordinates living under the shadow of an increasingly unstable genius. Contemporary accounts suggest that by 1828, a plot was forming. It wasn't just about ambition. It was about survival. Many in Shaka's inner circle believed that if his paranoia continued unchecked, he would eventually kill them all. The question wasn't whether to act, it was when and how. If you're still here, this story is about to take a darker turn. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will show you how even the greatest empires are vulnerable when built around a single man. So stay tuned. By September 1828, Shaka had sent his main army north on a military campaign, leaving himself with a relatively small force at his royal kraal, his traditional compound. This was the opportunity Dingaan and Emachlengana had been waiting for. The historical accounts of what happened on that day vary in their details, but the core facts are consistent and brutal. Shaka was meeting with some European traders when his half-brothers, along with a servant named Mbopa, who was part of the conspiracy, approached him. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic speech. They simply stabbed him, repeatedly, the sharp blades of assassins, spears penetrating the body of the man who had revolutionized warfare through the intimate violence of close combat. As Shaka lay dying, some accounts record his final words as a warning to his killers: "You will not rule this land, for I see the swallows coming." He was referring to Europeans, the white traders and soldiers whose ships were increasingly appearing along the coast, whose colonial ambitions were beginning to focus on southern Africa. It was a prophecy that would prove devastatingly accurate. Shaka understood, even in his final moments, that the Zulu kingdom existed in a window of time, a brief period when African military innovation could dominate the regional landscape, but before European technological and industrial superiority would overwhelm everything in its path. Dingaan seized power after Shaka's death, quickly consolidating control and eliminating potential rivals, including eventually murdering Mhlengana, his co-conspirator. But Dingaan was not Shaka. He was a capable leader, but he lacked the military genius and the charismatic authority that had made Shaka's rule possible. More importantly, the world was changing in ways that military tactics alone couldn't address. European colonists were establishing permanent settlements in the region. The British Empire was extending its influence along the coast. And in a few decades, the Zulu nation that Shaka had built would face its ultimate test against an enemy equipped with rifles, artillery, and the full industrial might of Victorian England. Here's the shocking truth that most histories don't tell you: Shaka's military innovations didn't die with him. When the Zulu fought the British in the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, more than 50 years after Shaka's death, they were still using the tactics he had developed, and they were terrifyingly effective. At the Battle of Isandlwana, Zulu warriors using the bullhorn formation and fighting primarily with spears and shields annihilated a British force equipped with modern rifles, killing over 1,300 British soldiers in one of the most devastating defeats in British colonial history. It took the full might of the British Empire, multiple military expeditions, and the ruthless application of superior firepower to finally break Zulu military power. The kingdom that Shaka built from nothing proved to be one of the most formidable obstacles European colonialism ever faced in Africa. But the most shocking part of this story is what happened to Shaka's legacy in the decades and centuries that followed. In the immediate aftermath of British colonization, Shaka was portrayed in European sources as a bloodthirsty savage, a tyrant whose violence justified colonial intervention. The complexity of his achievements, the revolutionary nature of his military and administrative innovations, the fact that he had built a sophisticated state system in a region Europeans claimed was primitive, all of this was systematically downplayed or ignored. The narrative served a purpose: to justify colonization by portraying pre-colonial Africa as a place of chaos and savagery that needed European civilization to bring order. Over the following decades, as South Africa descended into the nightmare of apartheid, Shaka's image was further distorted. The apartheid government promoted a version of Zulu history that emphasized tribal warfare and violence, using it to justify policies of racial separation and the denial of political rights to Black South Africans. Meanwhile, authentic African historical perspectives were suppressed. Scholars who tried to present more balanced or nuanced views were marginalized, and the complex reality of Shaka's era was reduced to simplistic stereotypes that served political agendas. For over a century, Shaka was essentially erased from serious academic consideration as a legitimate historical figure worthy of study on par with other military innovators and state builders. When he was remembered at all in mainstream Western education, it was as a footnote, a minor warlord in a continent that supposedly had no real history worth studying. The systematic devaluation of African history, the assumption that nothing significant happened on the continent before Europeans arrived to document it, meant that figures like Shaka were deliberately ignored or distorted beyond recognition. It wasn't until the latter half of the 20th century, as African independence movements gained strength and African scholars began reclaiming their own histories, that a more accurate picture of Shaka began to emerge. Historians like John Wright and Carolyn Hamilton began carefully analyzing the available sources, separating fact from myth, and contextualizing Shaka within the broader patterns of state formation and military innovation that occurred in various parts of the world. They revealed that far from being a unique monster of savage violence, Shaka was a military genius whose tactical innovations paralleled developments in other parts of the world, whose state-building efforts were comparable to other empire builders, and whose legacy shaped Southern African history in ways that continued to resonate long after his death. Today, as we recover this more complete understanding of Shaka's life and legacy, we're not just learning about one remarkable individual. We're confronting uncomfortable questions about how history is written, about who gets to be remembered as a great leader versus who is dismissed as a tyrant, about the ways colonial powers systematically erased or distorted the histories of the peoples they conquered. We're recognizing that the same qualities that make us call Julius Caesar or Napoleon military geniuses are present in Shaka's campaigns, that the same nation-building processes that we study in the formation of European states occurred in Africa, that innovation genius and historical significance are not limited by geography or the color of one's skin. Shaka Zulu's story forces us to confront the reality that empires rise and fall according to patterns that transcend any single culture or region. His transformation from rejected child to empire builder mirrors the hero's journey we celebrate in countless other historical figures. His military innovations demonstrate that tactical genius can emerge anywhere, given the right combination of circumstances and individual ability. His tragic end reminds us that the qualities that enable someone to build an empire, the ruthlessness, the single-minded focus, the inability to tolerate weakness, often contain within them the seeds of destruction. And his complicated legacy challenges us to think more carefully about how we remember history and whose stories we choose to preserve. The Zulu people today number over 12 million, making them one of the largest ethnic groups in South Africa. They maintain their language, many of their cultural traditions, and a strong sense of identity that can be traced directly back to the nation Shaka forged in the early 19th century. Every time a Zulu warrior dance is performed, every time the history of Southern Africa is taught with proper recognition of African agency and achievement, every time scholars dig deeper into the complexity of pre-colonial African states, Shaka's legacy endures. He didn't just build a kingdom that lasted a few decades. He created a people, an identity, a legacy that survived colonization, apartheid, and the systematic attempts to erase or diminish African history. Shaka Zulu reminds us that greatness can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that rejection and humiliation can forge extraordinary ambition, that a single individual with vision and will can reshape the destiny of millions. But he also reminds us that even the most magnificent achievements are fragile, that tyranny eventually breeds its own destruction, that the very strengths that make someone powerful can become their greatest weaknesses. And perhaps most importantly, his story reminds us that history is always more complex than we think, that the easy narratives we tell ourselves about progress and civilization often hide uncomfortable truths, and that the work of recovering and understanding the full scope of human achievement is never finished. The boy they mocked as the beetle child became a king whose very name meant power, whose military tactics influenced warfare for generations, whose empire challenged the greatest colonial power of the age, from small clan to regional superpower in 10 years, from nothing to legend. From outcast to the Napoleon of Africa, that's not mythology, that's history, and it's a reminder that the most extraordinary stories in human experience are often the ones we haven't been told. If this story opened your eyes to how much incredible African history has been overlooked or distorted, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the figures and events that changed the world but didn't make it into the standard textbooks. Let me know in the comments what other African leaders or kingdoms you think deserve to have their stories told with this level of depth and respect. Because here's what I've learned from researching Shaka's life: the truth is always more incredible than fiction. You just have to know where to look for it, and you have to be willing to question the simple stories you've been told about who matters in history and why. The past is full of giants we never learned to see. It's time we opened our eyes.